Okay, the title of this video is actually misleading because if you think about it, it's a trick question. It is not logically possible for NBA teams as a whole to be better during crunch time. Now, it is possible for some NBA teams to be better and some to be worse, but not everyone as a whole, because by definition, for one team to be better, that has to mean other teams have to be worse. Now, a better question to ask would be, okay, well, which NBA teams perform better during crunch time and why? Are NBA teams better on offense or defense during crunch time as a whole? Do teams commit more turnovers during crunch time? Do teams shoot more threes during crunch time? And these are questions that actually have answers. And in today's video, I think we're going to answer a lot of those questions that you guys may have about what crunch time actually means in the NBA from a statistical viewpoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to go on the NBA.com's official website for statistics, and we're going to sort through a bunch of different categories ranging from traditional box score stuff to advanced stuff to scoring stuff. And we're going to compare how teams perform in crunch time compared to how they perform regularly. But before we get into that, a brief shout out to SeatGeek for sponsoring today's video. SeatGeek is an app that you can download on your phone, and it is the best way to buy tickets to sporting events, concerts, comedy shows, whatever requires tickets. Anywhere from its great search function to its sorting methods, to sorting by price, sorting by seat, and its very unique features such as giving you really good previews for what your vantage point will look like from certain seats. If anything like that sounds interesting to you, download SeatGeek today and you can use my promo code MDJ for $20 off of your first purchase. First, a couple of ground rules before we begin, just so everyone's on the same page. First off, how does the NBA define crunch time or clutch time? Because it's a pretty vague term. The way NBA defines it is during the last 5 minutes of the game, whenever the point differential is 5 points or less, that is considered crunch time. Now, some people think that crunch time should maybe be defined more strictly. That is, some people think that crunch time really refers to like the last 2 minutes of a game. But the danger that you run into if you define crunch time that way is you end up with really small sample size. For me personally, I feel like the NBA's official definition of crunch time is pretty good. Secondly, because the focus of this video is to look at how NBA teams do in general in crunch time, I'm going to be looking at the average. So what I'm going to do for a lot of these statistics is I'm going to focus on what is the most league average team in this particular category. So I'm just going to be looking at, for instance, the 15th team in the league, the most average team. Essentially, I'm taking the median as the average for the league. And I actually think in most cases, the median is better than the mean, especially when you're dealing with smaller sample sizes, such as crunch time statistics. So anyways, let's jump first into the traditional stats. This is essentially box score stat sheets that you would see on any particular individual game. And there's a couple things to note here first, is that every single NBA team here in GP you see games played. Every single NBA team has played anywhere between 30 and 50 games that have gone to crunch time. And on average, they range anywhere between 3 to 5 minutes per game. So if you do the math, just basically, you end up with teams having anywhere between 100 to 200 minutes of crunch time play every single season. Now, 100 to 200 minutes is a good amount. It's enough, I think, to make basic judgments. But compared to the entire season, it is only but a fraction. 160 minutes, for example, is less than 4 full NBA games. So the question you have to ask yourself first when looking at crunch time statistics is this: how well can you determine a team's play, for instance, if you just watch them during 4 full entire NBA games? And the answer, I think, is, look, if you watch an NBA team for 4 straight games from start to finish, you can get a pretty good idea of how that team plays. But compared to the entire regular season, it's still a smaller sample size, which means there's more variance. There's not a lot of things to look at in the traditional box score stuff. One thing that I'm going to point out that I think should be obvious to everyone is free throw attempts. So what we're going to do is we're going to first change from per game to per 100 possessions. This is mostly to adjust for the pacing and the minutes. Per 100 possessions, generally speaking, is always better than per 36 minutes. But anyways, per 100 possessions, you look at free throw attempts. The most league average team averages about 34 free throw attempts per 100 possessions during crunch time. If you look at that in the general statistics, so how teams do when not just in crunch time, but just any time on the floor, and how often they shoot free throws, it's much less. About 22.5. Now, of course, this is mostly due to intentional fouling during crunch time, right? Team is up by 1, The opposing team has to foul, the other team shoots free throws, the opposing team usually tries to shoot threes to catch up. Now, you might be curious as to this right here, 3-point attempts. Do NBA teams shoot more threes during crunch time? Now, I want to answer this question, but using a different stat. We're going to go over to this right here, team clutch scoring. Scoring is its own individual category on the NBA.com's official website, and there are some interesting numbers here. For instance, this one right here is what we're really looking at. Percentage of field goal attempts that are 3-pointers. That's a better stat than just 3-point attempts per game or per 100 possessions. So, what are we looking at here? Well, no surprise, you see that the Houston Rockets are by far #1 in the league, and how many of their shots are 3-point attempts. And if we look at the league average, about 38% of a team's shots will be 3-pointers. And of course, it varies a lot between team to team, right? The last team in the league, the Spurs, only have 28%. But if we look at the general statistics and we do the same sorting, we see that the average, not in crunch time, is about 34. So it seems like during crunch time, there's a slight increase in 3-point attempts. Now again, part of this, or I think a good amount of this, can be attributed to what we just talked about with free throws in catch-up situations where teams are often down by 3 or they need to foul. What else is there to look at? Well, another thing I want to check out is the percentage of field goals made that are unassisted, and we can divide this by 2s and 3s. Let's look at 3s first because this is the most interesting to me. Percentage of 3-point field goals made that are unassisted, and usually an unassisted 3-point field goal is a pull-up 3-point shot, to put it in simple terms. If you look at the league average, you see that it's about 17% of 3-point field goals made are unassisted. Pretty low percentage, 1 in 5. If you go to crunch time, the league average, if you sort by percentage of 3-point field goals made that are unassisted, you see that the league average is about 26%. It rises almost 10%. And for some teams, it rises a lot more. In particular, I want you to check out this. Look at the Chicago Bulls. The Chicago Bulls have about 16.2% of their 3-point field goals made that are unassisted, generally speaking. But in crunch time, that number for the Chicago Bulls rises to 39.4% of 3-point field goals made unassisted, and they become #2 in the league. Admittedly, I did not watch a lot of Chicago Bulls games last season, but I believe this is Zach LaVine, right? This has to be the Zach LaVine effect. I can't imagine anyone else on the Bulls taking this many pull-up 3-point shots, but just something to look at. And again, like with the Bulls, you see there's a lot of variance between teams as to how these things play out, but league average wise, yes, you tend to see more pull-up 3s in crunch time. What about pull-up 2-point shots or ISO 2-point shots or just anything that's unassisted 2-point shots? Well, during crunch time, that number is about 58.7% for the average team. If you look at them not during crunch time, it's about 49.4%. Again, roughly a 10% increase during crunch time. Okay, now we're going to move on to advanced statistics. Now here is where things get pretty interesting. So first thing we can look at is offensive rating. Which teams perform marginally better during crunch time last season than they did in general? And the Boston Celtics topped that list by far. The Boston Celtics had the best offensive rating during crunch time last season at 125, which is completely ridiculous if you stretch that out to the general offensive rating. But when they weren't in crunch time, or just generally speaking, they were only 111. So that's a plus 14 jump. Yet, what is very striking is that the Boston Celtics are only 23-19 in close games. Technically, what it just means is that when the Boston Celtics won during crunch time, they won by a significant margin, whereas when they lost by only a couple points, maybe to a buzzer beater or to a last-minute shot. Does that say anything in particular about the Celtics? I'm not really sure. Now, if you sort by net rating, you see that the Clippers had a plus 17 net rating in crunch time last season, a big departure from their regular season net rating, which is all the way down at 13th, only 1. Why were they so good in crunch time? Well, for them, it was mainly defensive. You see the defensive net rating was 110 during the general time, and their defensive rating during crunch time was 99.1, a 10-point drop. And a 10-point drop in any rating is the difference between being top 10 in the league versus bottom 5 in the league. So it's a massive difference. Could you really attribute that to anything? I don't know. Again, you see the minutes right here on the left-hand side. 154 minutes is the sample size we have to work with crunch time minutes last season for the Clippers here. Okay, now let's look at things like offensive rating for the average team. Let's see, are teams on average better during crunch time, or are they not? Well, the average team in offensive rating was the Toronto Raptors in regular season at 109 during crunch time. And generally speaking, the average offensive rating was about 110. So not a big difference. In fact, almost negligible difference. Teams are not better on offense, which means they're also not that much better on defense. Some teams are better in crunch time offensively and perhaps defensively. Some teams are worse, but on average, there's not a difference that exists. Let's look at a couple other things. This one is very interesting to me. Assist percentage. And this is one of the biggest statistical difference you'll see in crunch time statistics. Assist percentage is what percentage of the team's field goals were assisted. Pretty simple. You have the average team, which in crunch time is about 50%. During not crunch time or during general time, the assist percentage for the average team is about 60%. So there's a 10% drop in assist percentage when crunch time happens. Again, more isolation, less ball movement, less passing. Okay, another thing I want to look at is true shooting percentage. So does true shooting percentage change at all during crunch time? And you see 55 in the general time, and then when crunch time comes, that true shooting percentage goes to about 55. Doesn't really change. Again, for some teams, it changes more. For some teams, it changes less, but it stays relatively the same for the league average. And then let's look at pace. Does pace increase during crunch time? Do teams play faster or do they play slower? Look at the average pace during crunch time is about 103. And if you look at the general pace, it's about 100. So teams do play a little bit faster during crunch time. Although I would add a little bit of caution to that, because this statistic is likely, again, manipulated by the fact that in endgame scenarios, you have teams intentionally fouling each other, which increases the amount of possession. So for example, in a very close game, during the last 30 seconds of the game, there can be 5 possession switches, and that alone can increase the pace a lot. I would actually think that if you take away those endgame scenarios, those free throw scenarios, you would actually see a decrease in pace during crunch time, because teams, generally speaking, especially if you're ahead, the team tries to run out the clock, and you usually hold the ball until there's no more than 5 seconds left on the clock, and that's when you take a shot. Turnover percentage. Turnover percentage. Do teams commit more turnovers during crunch time? Let's look at it. Generally speaking, it's about 13% of possessions end up in turnovers. During crunch time, that number drops to about 12.4%. Let's look at offensive rebounding percentage. This to me is pretty interesting. Generally speaking, the average offensive rebounding percentage is about 26.9. So the Pacers grabbed about 26.9% of available offensive boards. And if you look at the statistics during crunch time, you see that the average shoots up to about 32%. Now, why is that? I actually don't really know. I'm not completely sure. It might, again, have something to do with free throw situations, that maybe during free throw situations, it's easier to get offensive rebounds. Maybe teams just crash harder on the glass. Okay, lastly, we're going to look at some stats that are categorized as miscellaneous by the NBA. So FBPS, what does this stand for? FBPS stands for fast break points. So first thing we're going to do, as always, we change this to 1 per 100 possessions for both, because that's what we do around here. Now we see that in general last season, the Sacramento Kings were the fastest team in the league. They had the most amount of fast break points per 100 possessions, about 20 points coming from fast break per 100 possessions. A lot of this is attributed to De'Aaron Fox, but also just the team running out on the break in general, play style. So if you look at the league average in general, it was about 12 fast break points per 100 possessions. And if you look at during crunch time, that number drops to about 8. And that is a pretty noticeable difference. That is about a 50% decrease, or actually no, about a 30% decrease, I should say, in crunch time fast break opportunities, and I think this goes along with the pace thing. Generally speaking, things slow down, and especially in crunch time, what you will often see is that teams are better at getting back on defense during crunch time. And a big contributing factor, honestly, to that is just effort, right? During crunch time, the effort level goes up. On offense, on defense, everywhere. And getting back on defense a lot of times is about effort. It's just about hustling back. It's just about, moving, running back as fast as you can, even though you don't want to. And during crunch time, I think you see teams, generally speaking, play better transition defense, which makes it harder to score fast break points. Okay, another statistic that I want to look at that's interesting in here, PITP stands for points in the paint. Points in the paint during crunch time. If you look at it, generally speaking, the average is about 48 points per 100 possessions come in the paint. If you look at it during crunch time, that number drops to about 41 points. Well, what this tells us is that because we know that there's not that big of a difference in the amount of three-pointers shot during crunch time, that this means 2-point field goals are often converted from inside shots in the paint to mid-range jumpers during crunch time. And I think if you pay attention, anyone who's watched basketball often enough can probably tell you that that's what happens in crunch time. Generally speaking, you see more mid-range shots being taken. Okay, well, that's all I have for today's video. I think this will end up being pretty long already, so I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to link the NBA's official website down in the description below, and I encourage you guys to play around with this stuff yourself. I think it's fairly well designed. It takes some time getting used to how the filters work and everything like that, and sometimes it's kind of frustrating because you don't know which stats are placed into which categories, but I will still put it down in the description below. And if you're a fan of a particular team, it could be very fun and very enlightening, I think, to look through your team's particular changes in terms of how they do in crunch time versus how they do in general, or just look at whatever statistics you want. I'll give you guys one last nugget that I found before I go, just stuff that you find when you play around with this stuff. So if you look at offensive rating, for instance, let's do for the Orlando Magic. So for the Orlando Magic, if you look at their offensive rating, generally speaking, it's, let's see, about 108, and they're 22nd in the league. Now, if you go to crunch time, their offensive rating dropped to 95.8. They had a 13-point drop in offensive rating, going from 22nd in the league to 29th in the league. Why is that? Well, I would argue that's just because the Orlando Magic, first off, have no superstar, but most importantly, they have probably the weakest players at the backcourts and wing positions. That in crunch time, they're relying on guys like DJ Augustine and Evan Fournier to make plays. Thank you guys for watching this video. I know this is a different format of a video and it's maybe a little bit weird to watch. I hope that made it easier. I intentionally made these numbers larger, made the zoomed into the browser to make this easier to look at, especially if you're watching this on your phone. But I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, and if this video gets a lot of support, then I will make a part 2 to this video, probably looking at how individual players do in crunch time, or actually anything statistical related. So thank you guys for watching. I will see you next time.